attacked a crowd of 10,000 people demonstrating on the 71st anniversary of national independence in Czechoslovakia. In the biggest demonstration in the country in 20 years, the protesters demanded the ousting of Czechoslovakia's communist leader Milos Jakeš. But only 25 minutes after the peaceful protest began, hundreds of riot police moved in, armed with truncheons.
50,000 people were there in Wenceslas Square, the biggest illegal gathering since the Prague Spring of 1968. By the statue of King Wenceslas at exactly 3 in the afternoon, the banners were unfurled and the chanting began. Freedom! We want a new government! Long live Charter 77, they shouted. The plainclothes police moved in quickly, making violent snatch arrests. Then came the riot squads, sealing off the square and moving down to clear it. But the people were defiant and turned the demo into a slow march, keeping up the chanting. All day, people had been waiting for this, a chance to push Czechoslovakia along the reform road Hungary and Poland have already begun to travel. But this government is made up of the same men put in power by the Soviet tanks of '68 to crush reforms. For them, the start of democratization would mean the loss of their jobs. So although everyone believes change will come, it's hard to say when. The people of Prague remember '68 vividly, and until today, only a few, like playwright Václav Havel and the Charter 77 group, were prepared to challenge the communists. Now the time may have come. The size of this demonstration proves that the tide of Eastern European freedom has begun to break through the Czechoslovakian border. Dan Damon, Sky News, in Prague.
40 people have been rescued in the...
Leadership says it will try to embrace the type of reforms sweeping other parts of the communist world. But leaders in Czechoslovakia have signalled a rejection of any reform by ordering heavily armed police to crush a big pro-democracy demonstration in Prague. 355 people were arrested, including 17 foreigners. There were many injuries as police used batons to drive a wedge into a crowd of more than 10,000 people rallying in Prague's central square. It was the biggest anti-communist rally in Czechoslovakia in 20 years, since the tragic events of the Prague Spring.
After yesterday's demonstration, white-helmeted riot police were out on the streets of the Czech capital all night, reinforced by the workers' militia, a part-time communist army. Arrests mounted during the night as activists and the usual suspects were rounded up. The total is now approaching 400. The size of yesterday's demonstration was the important thing for the opposition. If they could prove to the government that the people were prepared to stand up to police brutality, they might force change on the communists. It's clear that they achieved even more and have pushed Czechoslovakia close to the center of the reform whirlwind in Eastern Europe. The police reacted swiftly and harshly, of course, the usual knee-jerk reaction, but compared to previous occasions, there was less violence, and the water cannon were held back. Now the country is tense and expectant. The lesson from East Germany is that if the opposition keeps up the pressure, the government may soon take it seriously. The lesson from China is more frightening, and after '68, the people of Prague already know what it's like to have tanks in the square. But before the Second World War, Czechoslovakia was an island of democracy in Central Europe. Maybe that tradition can be rediscovered even more quickly than anyone dared hope only a year ago. Dan Damon, Sky News in Prague.
And across the border in East Germany, public rallies organised by the communist authorities turned into anti-government protests. Up to 20,000 people filled the square outside East Berlin's town hall. They demanded free speech, controls on the security police, and an end to privileges for Communist Party officials. Speakers called for the release of political prisoners and denounced police brutality. East Berlin's police chief drew whistles and jeers when he tried to justify jail sentences for some demonstrators. Thousands more demonstrated outside the capital's Congress Hall. And the exodus continues. Since Friday, at least 1,400 East Germans have crossed over the Hungarian border into the west. Hungary's Prime Minister, Miklos Nemeth, says East Berlin has no choice but to speed up reform. More than 47,000 East Germans have fled via Hungary since September the 10th.
South Africa Western camera crews for inciting violence at yesterday's rally in Prague. Several journalists have been detained by police today, and 17 foreigners were amongst the 355 arrested during the pro-democracy protests.
The claim was made on state television that Western crews had actually contributed to the violent scenes at Prague's pro-democracy rally by encouraging people to act up for the cameras. Several people were injured when riot police ploughed into the crowd, clubbing them with truncheons, grabbing them by the hair and forcing some to the ground. The official Czech news agency said today that police had used mild means to break up the rally, which was attended by more than 10,000 people. Czech police were out in force today in Wenceslas Square, checking identity papers of journalists and camera crews. Several were told to leave the area. 2 cameramen from the American cable news network and 2 others from a French station were taken away by police. Although some of the demonstrators called for citizens to return to the square today, central Prague has returned to normal as families enjoyed a quiet Sunday. But officers roamed the area checking identity papers, and the 355 arrested yesterday are still being held. Katrina Varmforth, Sky News.
In East Germany, public rallies organised by the communist authorities turned into anti-government protests. Some 20,000 people attended a rally outside East Berlin's City Hall. They demanded free speech, controls on the security police, and an end to privileges for Communist Party officials. East Berlin's police chief was jeered at when he tried to justify jail sentences for some of the protesters.
Demonstrators crammed into East Berlin's City Hall Square this afternoon. They'd been invited by the city's mayor to take part in a dialogue on reform with the communist authorities. But it was only when Politburo member Gunter Schabowski admitted that demonstrations would remain part of East Berlin's political culture that he drew any applause. The demonstrators took the opportunity to denounce police brutality in breaking up protests and to demand the release of political prisoners. Elsewhere in the city, 4,000 East Berliners attended a rally at a church where leading artists and writers called for democratic reforms. Today's protests follow marches last night in 3 East German cities. The groundswell of opinion in favour of reform shows no sign of slowing, its hands strengthened by the uncompromising methods used by the security forces in suppressing protests in Leipzig earlier this month and in East Berlin just after Mikhail Gorbachev's visit to the capital. The tide of protest against the hardline regime, along with the exodus of refugees to the west, sounded the death knell of Erich Honecker's political career. Although his successor, Egon Krenz, has shown himself amenable to dialogue, the prospects for East German-style glasnost have yet to prove themselves. Peter Godfrey, Sky News.